Next up, let's talk about how to implement this design pattern for a class. Now, if you're a fan of UML diagrams, I got you covered. Here you can see how we could apply the Singleton design pattern to this my class. And yeah, that's just UML implementation. Singleton design pattern consists of two important elements. First, a private static variable. This private static variable stores the single instance of the class. And the second thing we need is a property, or more specific, just a static getter, which should also be public. And this allows to easily access the instance of this class. Now let's first look at the easy access part. So I have this Singleton class, so it's just any class, and we are now going to apply the Singleton design pattern to this class. So first off, we need this private static variable that I mentioned. And this needs to be of the type of the class itself. That's important. Next up, we have the public static getter, and it just returns this private variable here. The last thing is very important. You have the awake method, and in this method you set this my instance to be this exact instance. So if you now remember, static variables are stored in the class level, okay? And instance variables are stored on instance level. These are both static variables, so they are stored on class level. So you can access them directly via the class. You don't need a reference to an instance. You can access them directly via the class. And that's very handy because now we can very easily access them. So yeah, that's important to initialize this my instance to be just this. Note, if you're doing plain C#, this won't work because plain C# doesn't have the awake functionality. So it needs to be done a little bit different. Now that we have this, we can access the Singleton very easily. Now, if I have some different class, for example, here the player controller, I can access the Singleton exactly like this. Just write Singleton class dot my instance, then dot name or whichever variable you want to use. And yeah, that's that. So far, so easy, not hard. Note, the great advantage here is we don't need a public variable, which needs to be dragged and dropped. Now, next up, how do we achieve the uniqueness? You remember, singletons should only be instantiated once. There should not be more than one instance of a singleton class. Now, how do we achieve this? We need to expand upon our singleton. So this is the same thing that we did before, but in the awake method, we need to do something slightly different. And let's look what this is. We first check if the my instance variable is null. If it is null, it means that there is no singleton already. There's no instance of this singleton. So we can safely set my instance to this. But do mind that it could be possible that my instance is already set. That would happen if you already have an instance of singleton class and the awake function for singleton class was already called. So my instance is already set. Now, if it is already set, I know there is at least another singleton. Now, what I do is slightly complicated. I'll show you right away why I do so much writing here. So I just log an error and I say there are multiple instances of the type, in this case, the singleton class. And then I say, I provide this log error method with a reference to this game object. And then I do the same and I provide a reference to the game object of the already existing singleton. So I write two errors, one for the first Singleton instance and one for the second Singleton instance. And I'll show you right away why I'm doing this. Now I'm back here in the little demo scene, and I'm going to create now two Singleton classes, Singleton class 1 and Singleton class number 2. And I just copied the code that I just showed you into Unity, and I'll just drag the Singleton class on the first and on the second instance. And of course, we shouldn't have two instances of the Singleton. But let me show you what now happens if we would have this anyway. We get two error messages, and if I press the first one, did you see that? It marked the first Singleton. If I press the second one, it marked the second Singleton. Now, why I do this is I'm working quite a lot with students. And what students sometimes do, they have a big project like this, and they do something like this, or something like this, or something like this. And then they have somewhere a Singleton, and you can't find it that easily. So they just randomly drag it anywhere, and that's a huge problem. It's a pain in the ass if you're then looking for them. I mean, yes, you could right click and select find references in scene and you would find them, but I like to just mark the object that causes the errors anyways. So that's just my way of doing it. It's not that important. It's just a nice feature, I think. And yeah, it just causes a little bit code, but that's everything. Now let's look at the pros and the cons of this design pattern. First, the biggest advantage is it simplifies access to other objects. That's a big advantage. That's very, very handy. Also, it ensures that there's only one single instance of the script. And that's very handy for manager scripts, because you usually don't want to have 5 game managers that track the time of your game or something like that. And the last one is this design pattern is rather easy to implement. I mean, it's a little code overhead, yes, but you can do it in 5 minutes if you know what you're doing. But there are some disadvantages, and the opponents of this design pattern say that these disadvantages outweigh the advantages by far. Now, first off, if you're using it very carelessly, it will mess up your software architecture. For example, if you use the Singleton design pattern on your player character, it might be fine, it might be all right. Then you code half a year on this, everything works out, it's fine. Then the publisher says, we want multiplayer. And if you did this with a Singleton, it's going to be hard to add multiplayer to that, because Singleton means that there's only one instance of your player character. Now you need maybe 4 instances of them. So you need to rewrite all of your code. That's a bad thing. So you really need to be careful where you use Singletons. I advise using them on manager classes, but I really want to discourage you to use it, for example, on player scripts or on coins or even on keys or some very concrete objects, because you never know if you at some point need more than 1 instances of them. So only use this design pattern if you're absolutely sure that there will only be 1 instance. Okay? Right. Next up, the second disadvantage is that this design pattern leads to tighter coupling. Now, what does tight coupling mean? Tight coupling means that the scripts are referencing each other very much. So there are many references between different scripts that don't have too much to do with one another. And this is a quality criteria for code. So you usually want to keep your coupling loose, so you don't have too many references to other scripts that are not too familiar with it. So yeah, that's a problem. The problem with this tight coupling is that if you change your manager just slightly, you might have to adapt 50 other scripts that reference this manager because it's such an important script. So that's also not the best thing. And also you need to handle a few edge cases, for example, when switching levels. Yeah, that's something you need to take care of, and you always have to mind in your back head. So the good thing is, I personally think the advantages outweigh the disadvantages, but only if you're working in small projects. As soon as you get big projects, the disadvantages get the upper hand. So if you're working a few days or a few weeks, maybe even up to 3 months on a project, if the project scale is rather small, I always use singletons. They are very handy, they're fast to implement, and they just work. That's fine. However, as soon as I know that I'm going to need a more sophisticated approach and the code base gets very big, singletons tend to mess up your code, and they really make it very hard to automatically test your code also. So for bigger projects, I highly suggest using Dependency Injection, which can be done with tools like Zenject. That's Cenject. And that's a plugin that you can use to achieve the same goal, to make accessing other scripts easier, but it doesn't mess up your code structure that much. However, to set this up, that's time consuming, and that's usually not worth it for small little projects. So yeah, to sum it all up, small project or even medium-sized project that take up to, 3 months, feel free to use singletons. That's no problem. You're going to handle it, it's fine, okay? However, if you're using singletons in very big projects, you're going to have trouble. Now I'll give you some examples for what I usually use singletons in my projects. I usually have a level manager that handles when, at what time doors open, or which buttons are connected to which doors, or something like that, okay? That's something that I find level managers to be quite handy. Also, I use it for game managers. We'll talk about game managers later, but basically the same thing. That's a script that tracks the time, how many lives the player has, what's his score, and so on. And that's just a script that you need to access from many different scripts. So it's usually very, very nice if you can access it easily. Next up, I have a UI manager. The UI manager handles all of the UI stuff, and you also need to access this from so many levels. Do mind, I have a UI manager that handles the whole UI, okay? So I don't make my button a singleton or my slider or whatever, because that would cause trouble, I guess. I just use the UI manager as a singleton, okay? Next up, the input manager is also quite handy if you have it as a singleton, because there should not be more than one input manager. And yeah, it highly depends on the project you're going to make. Manager classes are just a thing that you have in most games, and that's why you use it for them most of the time. Now, if you enjoyed this video, I want to invite you to my course over at Udemy. This course is solely devoted to design patterns in Unity, and there you will gain access to premium quality exercises and examples for these design patterns. Also, I will talk about more specialized and more advanced implementations of these design patterns. So if you press on the link in the description below, you will get a discount on the course. Anyways, I'll see you in the next video.